Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning into this interview with Laura Iesue. She is the former researcher of the Council of Hemispheric Affairs, and she's also a Ph.D. student of, Sociology at the University of Miami. Laura has been invited to join this interview, which is part of the Ser Mujer Latinoamerica project. As many of you already know, my name is Natalia Bonilla. I'm the producer of this documentary. So, Laura, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being here.
Sure, thank you for having me. I'm excited.
So today, Laura and I will be talking about criminal justice system in Guatemala and the role that we women in Guatemala are playing, and also different topics regarding gender-based violence. But before we start, Laura, can you please highlight us or tell us what is the nature of the criminal justice system for any of people that do not understand what criminal justice is?
Sure. So very broadly, criminal justice is really about how we administer punishment or how we deal with individuals who commit crime. And, it involves, of course, many different parts of, the government institution, different agencies. We're talking about the prosecutor's office, we're talking about the courts, we're talking about, defense. So many different aspects can really tie into the criminal justice system.
Okay, and how good should the criminal justice system be? Like, what are the guidelines so we can see, like, people that are in Latin America or the United States that are watching this webinar and they're thinking, okay, is my criminal justice system is good or not? Is there like a guideline to analyze whether it's failing or succeeding?
Sure. So, usually the rule of thumb that we hear so much, especially in Latin America, is this notion of the rule of law. So whether or not these institutions are able to protect the fundamental rights that are guaranteed under the Constitution. Are individuals, are they allowed a speedy and fair trial? People who commit crimes, are they apprehended in, a fast enough rate? But, also too, are their rights protected as well? Are we getting true confessions of somebody who actually committed a crime versus somebody who may be, forced into a confession? And there's also things too, the people who are in power who hold those seats, either in, the courts or the prosecutor's office, are they following the laws that are written for them and making sure that they are basically implementing justice the way that it's supposed to be done fairly and accurately. So,
in the case of Guatemala, let's just start. Why do you choose Guatemala specifically?
Yeah, so Guatemala's kind of been an ongoing project for me for a while, especially when we talk about issues such as migration and violence and some of the factors that are resulting in so many individuals choosing to come to the United States. My original work was really interested in what has been termed the Northern Triangle. I've been trying to steer away from that word for a while just because it tends to really kind of push this idea of militarization and militarism. So really, when we talk about these countries, I'm really trying to steer away from using those words and sticking more to, Honduras, Guatemala. I'm not sure if everybody agrees with me on that, but I think it's something we need to think about and how we use these terms. But as for Guatemala specifically, Guatemala has a lot going on right now. They just kicked out CICIG, which is one of the anti-impunity bodies that was really helping to push with, the rule of law and really implementing some of these criminal justice structures. Trump recently revoked aid to Guatemala as well as Central America more broadly, and a lot of that money was for reforming and really building up these criminal justice institutions, especially the military. So many different issues are going on, especially now too that we've seen Guatemala has approved the Safe Third Country Act as well too. So.
Okay, so in the case of to go a bit backwards, knowing the history of Guatemala, which has been enduring a war and also a genocidal attempt towards its indigenous people. Has your work gone to that to those decades, or is it more recent?
Right now, it's more recent, especially for my PhD. I think I'm really trying to kind of go back from the beginning. especially since the signing of the peace accords. And the reason for that is, so many of these institutions have been plagued. So much of the corruption and violence that we've seen going on really manifested itself during the Civil War, but really even gained another stronghold once the peace accords were signed. We saw specific groups were, allotted, certain liberties on, how laws would be made and what things were recognized. So I think there's definitely a need to push back and to kind of look at, especially when the peace accords were signed and what the fallout has been. Some good, of course, but also, some negative ramifications.
My question sparks from the nature of the criminal justice system. Since before the Civil War started, there was a system in place, and it could be a failing system, and then just the peace accord just kind of went with the same previous notions and just continue failing? Or is it, have you find that after the peace accord, there were some reforms made to the criminal justice system that tried to make it better, but it didn't?
I'm trying to think of specific examples. I do agree with you. There were these systems that were in place. I can't really say whether or not they were failing or not, or if it was so much of, broader issues that were going on at the time. We had the coup and obviously the U.S. involvement with that, with the United Fruit Company. So, these things matter in the context of whether or not an institution is failing or how we even judge how an institution is able to work. But with that being said, I think one of the really hard things that has happened is since we've started to, like, quote unquote, reform the criminal justice system, we've been implementing policies that are US based, that we're like, yeah, these seem to really work well in the US. Let's transfer them abroad and see how they work there. And so sometimes in those cases, we're finding now that they really didn't work that well in the US. So, why do we decide to transfer them to begin with? So we need to keep that into context. What are these policies that we're transferring and why that matters, and also kind of what some of the fallouts are for those. Do I think everything that we've transferred or things that Guatemala has adopted have been a failure? Absolutely not. But I do think that tends to kind of develop in its own ways. We may give them a blueprint like, yes, this is how you need to say, police communities. But ultimately, how that's done is going to be with what's in Guatemala, how they decide to implement those practices, whether it's actually on paper versus in person, on the streets, or, totally two different things.
In that case, can you give us examples of US-based policies that were trying to be transferred after the peace accord that you think that do not fit the context of Guatemala?
Sure. Yeah, a lot of them have actually been policing, and I think we're finally starting to steer away from this now. But especially in the 90s, the U.S. was really involved with implementing this idea of stop and frisk policies within Latin America, especially in countries like Guatemala and El Salvador. And in the U.S., this is really used to, put police on the streets and to basically stop crime before it happens. But a lot of it was, they would be patrolling the streets. They would see somebody they perceived maybe a criminal, or they thought they were carrying a gun or carrying drugs, and they would stop them on the streets and basically frisk them, hence the name stop and frisk. So a lot of those policies were really kind of supported in Latin America, and they're like, yeah, this is something we want to implement, especially when dealing with gangs. And what we would see is police would actually stop individuals, whether they, were actually criminals or not. Didn't really matter. They would still stop them. We saw, basic fundamental rights being violated in this case. What even deems somebody a suspicion of either being criminals? And a lot of these policies have had significant pushback in the U.S., especially it's really implemented communities of color. And so we're starting to see that in Latin America too, that we see specific groups or specific minorities getting having their just basic rights violated and, being stopped when there really was no necessity for them to be stopped.
Is there a specific US-based policy that was transferred to the Guatemala system that is hurting women specifically?
Not that I'm aware of, no. That's a good question. I have to check up on that. No, I don't think there's been any one in particular that has significantly impacted women. And certainly if anybody else knows of any ones, I definitely want to know about it.
But in that case, this stop and frisk policy is very concerning, because if there's like I mean, there's this notion of preventive action from the authorities. Um, has there been any cases where this kind of preventive action is literally targeting gender? You know, like gender, it's creating gender-based violence, because police can say, "Yeah, I'm gonna stop that woman because she looks suspicious," and
Good question. That's an interesting thing to ponder, especially if we consider the role of women in gangs. That may be definitely something to look into. I think those policies are really more, they really were kind of adopted into this idea of like, mano dura policies or super mano dura, and that's how they were implemented. And, most of it was targeting gangs. So like, oh, you like after you now before it gets out of hand. So that'd be really interesting, especially to see, for women who are either a part of a gang or perceived to be part of one.
yeah, because there's like this whole like stereotyping of profiles, right? Like the
Yep.
so going deeply into the criminal justice system, I see it as you were saying in two ways. The first is the institutional level, and also the grassroots level that's trying to achieve justice, right? Um, the criminal system in Guatemala so far, how do you think, in general terms, is it failing or succeeding in helping stop or eradicate gender-based violence?
Sure. I actually think it's kind of a mixed bag. So when we talk about gender violence, we need to think of, the prosecutor's office, the Department of Justice, your typical judges, and also, your defense attorneys. And all three of those have really kind of been all over the place. There's really, like, some of them have done better dealing with gender-based violence, and even just the promotion of women in key roles. So, like, the Justice Department, they're really still lacking in the number of women judges. And this is a trend that has stayed, relatively the same for several years. So, what does that mean? That means, if we have cases of, domestic assault or sexual violence that ultimately make it to court, we don't have women, even though they're supposed to be impartial, we still don't have women in those positions who can, look at this for and provide gender perspective to issues. Another group I mentioned, also like the forensic department, the national group that deals with forensic, and the women in those positions slightly. Yeah. So one group I forgot to mention was the forensic department, basically the Institution Nacional de Ciencias. And the role of women, especially in key positions, has increased slightly, but overall it's still relatively stable. Women make up about 43% of positions there versus 56%. That was 2007. It has stayed relatively constant. Well, it's good that there's so many women in those roles, but it's still this issue of access to handle cases in which women are victims of sexual violence or other forms of assault. And so to have more women in those key roles who, they hear details of attacks towards women. Obviously, if a woman is attacked, they may not be as versus a woman. And it really kind of removes that gender barrier. More people in those key roles. The defense department were actually the majority in 2016, and still staying above the for now. So that's a good thing. Basically, with the high rate of violence against women in Guatemala, there's again key for women to be in these positions. They are there to that rule of law, making sure that necessarily, but they really do a good job making sure that those channels are pushed. We hope to see that we'll kind of see a little bit more of that along the way. I mean, still do better. Have better coverage. Like I think it's only like 10% of there's about 10% of geographic coverage for women and for the public. However, another plus side of that, thankfully there's still specialized sports for women, especially focused on genocide and violence against women, and national coverage for that is about 50%. So it still could be better. Placing these in key areas of violence or access to this. And thankfully, that I'm aware of, they're still operating without Trump. I'm not sure what their funding allocation is. But as of now, they're still going good. There's no issue.
I have a question regarding the grassroots movements and civil organizations that are helping women, achieve justice in a structure or a government that is widely known to be corrupt. You know that there was this Sarkos case that definitely took years to achieve justice, and right now there's another one going on with Hogar Seguro femicides that took place in 2017. What are your thoughts regarding the civic movement trying to achieve justice? Is it possible that, or have you found that there is power in the way that the population is taking justice or claiming justice?
Absolutely. I mean, it's always possible, but of course that doesn't mean it's not dangerous. Really the biggest thing is just continue to collectively organize and to really push back on the state and demand for it. I think unfortunately we kind of see this as, the government is so corrupt. That's not really the case. Eventually the state is going to make mistakes, and that's going to come for these groups to find their way in and to at least make some kind of change. Do I think all change is going to be made overnight? Absolutely not. But continual pressure and organization is always going to generate some kind of results. And with that being said too, I think it gets a little hairy. A lot of organizations come together because they feel like they're all fighting for the same resources, and of course there's limited resources. And so we just really need to keep that in mind. Ultimately we're all fighting for the same common to really push these ideas forward. And I'd also say too, I think we tend to look at and really networks to really talk about, how does this impact transgender, LGBTQ, so these are all different things that we need to look at.
Regarding women in key roles and the many challenges women are facing running into politics and running into, trying to get to justice or talking about, gender-based violence in these macho culture countries, right? And it is something that we see also in the Northern Triangle, which are like three main, one of the worst gender-based violence rates in the whole Latin America region. In seeing that women are facing these challenges to their health, to their, life-threatening, what do you think could be a way where women can definitely push forward these glass ceilings and try to achieve these top positions and be taken more into consideration?
The $1 million question. Honestly, all I can say is, if you're running for a key position and you are be, about you or spreading these narratives. Get to the sort of the problem and either call them out on it. And I mean, really, I sometimes feel like the best thing you can do is just, throw it in their face.
Which also leads me to another question, and it's the I know it may sound like a bit bizarre to ask you this, but do you think that maybe the conception of the criminal justice is already masculine, and we need to revisit it and try to see a feminist way of approaching criminal justice, the way it's in theory and in practice?
No, I think it'd be I think I agree with you. Especially even the way we look at police. This is something like hyper masculine thing where, you throw down the bad guy, you get rough people. And that plays out with a lot of women who are police officers, where they're perceived as you're not tough enough to handle, specific criminals, or they get more relegated positions more so than a man. And even too, this is kind of a catch-22, especially when we look at police. A lot of women get relegated to these positions that are dealing with other women or even dealing with children because they're perceived as being able to handle those better. And to a degree, especially if we're talking about gender-based violence, I think that's true. But the fact that men can't learn to also learn how to handle those conversations more appropriately and more effectively. And, not like one of the key, things I would hear, people who had, run-ins with the police, it was a domestic altercation, where they were just like, yeah, I'm not going to do anything about it because this is ultimately between you and your husband. And they just totally dismissed it. And, who's to say, what happened with that person down the road because of that? So there's definitely a need to, to transform the way we think of criminal justice, more of a, a feminist lens, or more of a women's role, even in, like prison reform, how do we handle jails and ultimately the sentencing of individuals, all these things I think definitely could really benefit from a more gendered perspective.
Yeah, because I think also that the whole point about like the prison reform, we're taking men that have done violent crimes or that have engaged in violence, any type of violence. We are taking them to prisons, and I don't know if there's this rehabilitation concept going on in Guatemala. I mean, it certainly is like a part of the rehabilitation here in the US, but and still is under question because you never see clearly where the rehabilitation is taking place, but then you have a context of violence that is not, how is it, addressed. So these people continue doing their prison time, getting out, and continue going to violence and to poverty and this cycle because that's what they know. So do you think that's accurate in Guatemala, or like is there like other policies that are taking place that are trying to fix that?
Sure. I don't know a ton about the corrections department. I do mostly on, policing and, of course, migration. But one of the things that I do know that we are seeing is these really become areas where criminal networks, especially, with trafficking, gangs, where those networks can really form and take place. And then once they're out, to be re-implemented on the streets. I'm not really sure what type of rehabilitation services are available to individuals who get out of prison. Certainly in the U.S., they have, key ways that they can get people, reacclimated into their community and try to, quote unquote, make them better productive members of society. But for Guatemala, I'm not really sure what's in place about that. So,
yeah, because it's like if they were part of already a criminal network, it is easy to just join after you finish your time because it's what you know. It's like rather than just starting over. I think my main concern is that putting people in prison without, like you said, good policies in place or a rehabilitation process, etc. doesn't address the root of the violence, just continues the cycle. It's like, okay, so they got me, and whatever, I can find the same job. It's waiting for me. I mean, I'm laughing, but I'm not laughing.
Yeah, I mean, like one of the key things that's supposed to be done with, prison time is supposed to basically this idea of making the punishment harsher than the crime that you committed. Like you're like, wow, that really sucked. I don't want to commit that crime again. Which we all know, when you have limited resources or you were stuck within a community where, crime is an everyday occurrence and something that you need to do to stay alive. We see that's not always the case. And somebody has to decide between, potentially going to jail again or, raising money to take care of their family, or even still, they need to put a hit on somebody because the gang that they're already involved with told them. So like, obviously they're gonna be like, okay, I'm gonna risk the potential for jail time if it means, being able to survive another day or take care of my family. So.
In the terms of women specifically, we're mentioning human trafficking, being that 80% of human trafficking victims are women and girls. In the case of Guatemala, do you think that there's a good prosecution of people that are doing this kind of crimes, or do you think that they're left to their own? It's like,
yeah. I think it's a work in progress. There's definitely been some improvements, especially with everything I mentioned earlier. And it's becoming more of a key issue and something that they want to focus upon. With the new administration, I'm not sure how important that is going to continue to be. It remains to be seen. But I do think it's an issue that's going to keep rising, especially too for individuals who are to migrate either to Mexico or to the U.S. Most of them use coyote, and or either get caught up in some type of trafficking, whether it's for sexual exploitation or even for labor standards. Recently in the U.S., were involved with a large trafficking scheme out of Guatemala, where they were recruiting people for labor, undocumented minors at that, and basically like, have you come work for us on this farm? We're going to guarantee you school. You're going to have basically just sold them to have this great life, and then ultimately they were all living in a trailer with no heat, middle of winter, working for this farm, deplorable conditions. And I don't even know what ultimately happened to those individuals once the trial came. I know that they were protected while the trial was in progress. What's happened to them. That was in Ohio. I think it's about 2 years ago. I think it's about the last time we talked about that. These are key issues that are going to continue to come up, and especially too if we look at the context of migration, and if we look at how the U.S. is really trying to make it hard to find reasonable outlets for asylum seeking, or even to get to the U.S. in general. We're going to be pushed to go into these hands because these traffickers are like, yeah, we're going to find you a way to the U.S. We're going to find you a way back to your family. And even for women still, there's such a problem with even sexual women who are migrating. I think it's like 80-90% of all women who travel to the U.S., especially through Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, are at some point sexually assaulted. And it's to the point now where even like organizations, Catholic church, like local community churches, who at one point 100% against contraception, like, and if you want to go to the U.S., we're going to find you ways to get you birth control. So at the very least, you don't come out of the situation pregnant.
wow. Is there any current initiatives, peace initiatives that you think are good to know that we should be looking at, that are doing a good job?
There was a few, and I was so glad that you asked me this before we had our interview, because I kind of like reached out like, hey, everybody, what are some good groups that you think of? So I'm working on compiling a list of some different groups that are on the ground. I think most of them are in Guatemala City, but there are some in some other areas. So I will have that list to you hopefully by Friday, and I'll send it along and we can share it with everybody. And it's good to keep a list for you. So if anybody wants to great work, you know, I definitely want to add them to the list.
That's amazing. In that case, like if people want to reach out to you and get to know more about criminal justice and your whole research on Guatemala, where can they reach you? And
Yeah, absolutely. Well, certainly, you know, you can contact my email account at Miami. It's just lti3@miami.edu. Or of course, you can reach me on Twitter, Laura, Laura .issue, IESUE. And let's
yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Laura, for your time, and thank you for all this knowledge.
thank you.